I am very pleased to introduce Alicia Menendez. Alicia Menendez is a research associate and a newly minted associate professor in the Harris School of Public Policy and a lecturer in the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. She is a development economist particularly interested in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, and she is affiliated with the Center of Latin American Studies. Her research interests include poverty and inequality, labor markets, human capital, and household behavior. Ms. Menendez received her PhD in economics from Boston University. Before coming to the University of Chicago, she was a lecturer in public and international affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School and a research economist at the research program in development studies at Princeton University. Please join me in welcoming Alicia Menendez.
Okay. Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be here today with you. Alex was telling you I'm a development economist, so probably this is going to sound a little bit different from the previous speaker because we come from different points of view. I was thinking when I was invited to do this, what type of presentation I wanted to give. And I chose to link globalization with child labor. Two main reasons to do that. Obviously, both topics are extremely important to me as a development economist that has been doing field work in Africa and Latin America. I have seen a lot of poverty, child labor, and things like that. But the other reason is that I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about how this works. And some time ago, a few weeks ago, a little bit more, a couple of months ago, I was in a conversation and this lady was extremely upset. And the point she was trying to make was that with all this globalization and trade, this region she was talking about somewhere in Pakistan was receiving new firms and an export sector that was growing, and she was extremely concerned about how much child labor was going to increase there because of this. Totally the way that I wouldn't think about this, and I'm going to try to tell you why. So if anything I say is not clear, please interrupt and let me know. I know I have an accent, so some of the non-clear may be related to that. I don't mind. I repeat, I change the word, so it's clear. You just interrupt and tell me. It's not the TV. There we go. So the idea is to first define what do we mean by child labor. Believe it or not, the definition of child labor is not all that clear all the time, so we're going to try first to agree what we are talking about and what we are going to focus on. We are going to look a little bit at some data that we have is getting better than before. Years ago, we were just estimating who was working and where. Now we have better surveys, and we're going to use those. The goal is to think a little bit about who is employing children, and that's going to be an important part of the talk. Why children work, causes for child labor, how globalization and international trade can affect, what are the mechanisms, what can we expect. I'm not doing funny mathematical economic theory here. It's going to be straightforward, plain English. And what evidence do we have? And there is not all that much, but there is some. So there is where we are going. We started working some time ago with this idea of defining child labor, and at the very beginning we were mostly thinking about just children that are employed somehow related to the production of some good that ends up in the market, that is trade in some way later. Doesn't need to be international trade, it's just you sell something somewhere. It's not quite a very clear definition. It doesn't give you an idea of how much those children work, and it's leaving something undefined there that is very common, which is household work. household work that can be quite a lot of the work that we see that children perform in developing countries, and hard work too. I don't know if you ever tried to take those big buckets of water and move them for some 100 yards from, the pipe somewhere to the home, but they are extremely heavy. It takes a lot of time, and that's a lot of the work that children do in the household production. So that's not quite the definition we want. When we talk about economic activities, again, it's economic activities, and we don't think of household production as much as economic activity, right? Because it doesn't end in the market so clearly. That are going to be harmful for children, what exactly do we mean? What is good for the children, what is not? It's very vague. So what UNICEF was trying to do was to be a little bit more precise, and they started with a definition that requires children from 5 to 11 to work at least 1 hour in a market-related activity, or 28 hours of domestic work per week. We have a little bit more if the child is older, 12 to 14, and then even increasing the number for those children that are between 15 and 17. If you ask me, it's an arbitrary definition. I mean, who said 28 versus 27? I mean, it's not that now I'm okay and my well-being is high and now, I crossed the 28-hour. But you have to define in some way, right? So take it a little bit as a guide, not as something so on stone. The International Labour Organization tried to do the same effort. UNICEF and the International Labour Organization are usually the international organizations that devote more effort to child labor understanding and programs that try to do research on it. And it is a little bit different, but sort of in the same spirit. They also include things that include the worst forms of child labor. This is something that I'm not going to talk a lot about because it's a different nature, but slave children, prostitution, all the illegal activities, children that are soldiers in armed conflicts, we have many of them in Africa, are a different type, a different form. I'm going to try to concentrate on most of the children that work. Let me show you. Under this estimate that ILO does, we have around 220 million children in these conditions. It's not a small number. They have estimates of this group that I was saying. I'm not going to focus too much on prostitution, slaves, children, soldiers. And they estimate, of course, measuring those things that are illegal is a little bit more difficult than doing household surveys and asking parents about the activities of their children, but the estimate is around 8 million of them. So a small an enormous number, and we wish we wouldn't have any, of course, don't take me wrong, but small proportion compared to the 220 total children. In 2001, for the turn of the century, UNICEF did an enormous effort in 36 very low-income countries with standard questionnaires. They went to households and they conducted surveys to assess the working status of children between 5 and 14 years old. This comprises 124 million children. So it's an enormous amount of children in very poor countries. So you have Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Nepal, places like this in the survey. What do they find is that 25% participate in market work. 25%. They find very low levels of wage employments. There are not that many children that get paid for their work, even when their work is related to a market good. Most of that market work they do is along with their parents. It's usually in agriculture, going to the field and working with them. Of course, the participation, the amount of work the children does in terms of participation, non-participation, and in number of hours grows up with age. And is higher in urban areas than is in rural areas. I teach a class in poverty and development economics for the grad students at Harris School, and we have a couple of lectures on child labor, and I always do the same joke, so I'm going to do it here. I ask them, what do they think when they think of child labor? And we usually, and it's not a joke actually, it's not even funny, we usually end up with an image that reminds me of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. The kids are chained somewhere in the mine or in the factory. Those things exist. It's a very, very tiny fraction of what happens. So if you want to really address the problem of child labor, you have to really understand how this occurs. It's not about going places and doing the indie thing, liberating the children that were working as slaves in the particular mine, because that's not the big thing. That may happen, and I think we should take care of it, but that bulk of 220 million children that I'm talking about are in the field working with their parents. So to address this problem, we have to have a different approach. Let me show the numbers that they find. This is what I was saying. All the children between 5 and 14 years old participating in the market are 25%. Less than 3% work for a salary. There are some that are unpaid, and you probably are wondering what is that about. There is foster care that requires children to work. Sometimes you work for some relatives somewhere in exchange for being in their home and being fed there and being able to attend school. Sometimes there are other forms of unpaid labor. Doesn't need to be slave labor. That is what I mean.
When you speak of less fit work, you're not talking about like chores or things around the house. I mean, you're just, are you?
In market work, no. But I'm going to talk about chores around the house in a moment. Okay. Family work in the market work means that I'm working with my family, probably in our plot where we are planting corn, that later we will sell in the market. Okay? So those kids are not paid as a wage. The parents don't give them a salary. The whole family benefits from whatever they can obtain in exchange for those goods that they produce together. As you can see, what I was saying before is that this is, of course, a lower percentage at young age, goes up with age. It's a little bit more for males than for females, although the differences are not so striking. And it's actually higher in rural areas than it is in urban areas. In urban areas, working with the family takes the form of being at the store. If they sell something on the street, the kid is there too, takes care of whatever activity they are doing. But it's sort of also that difference, those percentages are reflecting you that the most common form in these developing countries is that you work in agriculture with the rest of the family. Some numbers, so you have a sense of what percentage I'm talking about, from different surveys. These surveys that UNICEF did in these countries is actually in line with other independent surveys that we have. Nepal, 85% is agriculture. Ethiopia is almost 90%. Guatemala, to mention something in Latin America, below 65%, but still most of them. Domestic work is important too, and most of the children in these countries do some form of domestic work. I started using those definitions that ILO and UNICEF does, and they have a number of hours. I'm putting here all the kids that do any type of domestic work. So when I'm saying 65% of them do some domestic work, I'm not talking about 65% work more than 28 hours in the domestic work. They do some. And here you have that 65. Domestic work is around 65. Any type of work between market and domestic, many of them obviously overlap, goes almost to 70. And to give you some sense of the number of hours we're talking about, 20 or more hours per week only applies to 21% of the children. 40, much more closer to a full-time, applies to a little bit more than 6% of the children. One of the things that I wanted to show you is a dimension that sometimes is very interesting because it's one of the things you usually hear when we talk about domestic work. We imagine that it's just the girls that do this, and usually it is a little bit more for the girls, but the difference is not so enormous that sometimes the media makes it look like. Boys work too, and many of the activities do have to do with taking care of your younger siblings, but many has to do with collect wood for cooking, what I was mentioning before, water. Just going for water is an activity that is hard, it takes an enormous time, and you need all the time, you're never done with it. Taking care for some of the animals that you may have, feeding them, stuff like that. Why these children work? There was a time that the debate, usually you would read these papers that started with the type of parents you have. It was like, the parents that have children so they work. It is difficult to think that all the bad parents happen to live in these poor countries, right? So we are good, we are here, the other parents are bad, and that's why those children suffer. The way we think about this is obviously not that, is nobody wants their children to be doing hard work. The level of poverty pushes these families to do the best they can do with the alternatives that they have around. And sometimes that means that the children are part of the generation of income that you have. The way to think about this is what would be the kid doing if we're not doing this type of work? What is the best alternative that the kid has? In the perfect world, I would love to have these children just attending school, learning, playing, being, doing nonsense around, running, being happy. That perfect work doesn't exist for most of these people. So it's not quite that the choice that we have. And that's the reason why we link poverty to child labor, which is pretty much obvious what I'm saying, but I think sometimes in the debate this gets lost. So I prefer you to look at me and say, "Duh, I know that," than assuming that we are all in agreement with this. We know that when income goes up, child labor goes down. We have a lot of evidence about this. We have evidence that I'm going to show you in a moment, that is cross-country evidence. We have evidence within countries, and we have evidence if we follow families. Why this happens? Well, obviously because as income goes up, as my family has more income, the contribution my kids would bring has less value for us. It doesn't make too much sense to put the kid to work if we have a standard of living that is high. The basic assumption here is that the work of the kid per se is not desirable. In the extent that I have higher income, I can also substitute child labor. Imagine that you are talking about domestic work. I can buy wood at the store to cook instead of collecting it. It's more expensive. I can move to the place where I have a tap near my home or in my home instead of being far away and have to go far away to fetch the water. In our mind would be I can have a washing machine or something, right? Instead of doing it by hand. It's exactly the same substitution. The other idea is that as I have more income, things come together and makes investment in children more desirable. And this has to do a lot with education, with schooling of kids. So I can afford paying the school fees if there are any, but sometimes even when there is no school fees, is providing the ability to go to school that is not so close, or having a pair of shoes to go to school, or wear the uniform, or buy the textbook, or whatever other inputs you may need for the production of education. This is the graph that I was telling you when we look at this cross-country, and this is not news for you. What we have in the vertical axis is the percentage of kids between 10 and 14, in this case, that are economically active, they are working, and this is market activity. And in the horizontal, we have level of GDP per capita, income per capita. The PPP refers to take into account the prices in the country, so it's something that I can compare across countries. And you obviously see that countries that are doing better have less percentage of children that are economically active. The circles, I don't know, maybe you are all totally familiar with this, and I'm saying something that you obviously know, but the circles have the weight of the population of this country, so that gives you the idea of how many people we are counting there. And you can see some of the names of the countries, and gives you some sense of who we are talking about. This is clear, but it's also clear what happens within countries. We know that even in those poor countries are people that are better off, and their children do not work. The children of the bottom of the distribution of income do. And there have been not that many as we wish, but what we call panel studies. So you follow households through time, and you see the participation of the kids in the household depending on how much income these households have, or if they have a bad shock, somebody gets sick, or somebody gets fired, or some other bad event. We have some of those for Tanzania, the Philippines, and Vietnam, and we see exactly the same. In the extent that the household is doing better, the children are not working anymore. In the extent that the household is going through a bad time, the kids do. Now, how this links to globalization, which is our theme this week? Well, from a theoretical point of view, the answer is, I don't know if trade should increase or decrease child labor. It depends on many things. Let's be totally neutral, and let's imagine that with globalization, with trade, the demand for labor goes up. And I'm talking about the demand for labor for everyone that is able to work. What can happen? Well, as the demand for labor goes up, working is more attractive, because when the demand for labor goes up, wages get more attractive. So you could imagine that employment wages for children go up, and the opportunity cost of not working goes up, right? I mean, in economics, we talk about opportunity cost all the time. What we are thinking about is, what is my best alternative if I'm not doing what I'm doing right now? So if the kid is doing nothing at home or at school, what is the best alternative? And I'm changing the salary the kid could get in the market. So it could make not all the children, but the marginal children, to be more attractive, the parents obviously, not the kid, to send it to work. Or it could be that the parents have to work. It's more attractive for the parents to work. Mom is not in the household anymore, goes to work because she can earn good money now, it's attractive. So there is a kid that is taking care of the domestic activities. So directly or indirectly, you could have this effect. Now, that's all true, but at the same time, there is an effect that counterbalances, and that is what we call income effect. It's less necessary, the work of these kids, because those salaries are going up for the adults too, so they are increasing their income. And as we saw before, in the extent that I'm less poor, in the extent that the household has higher income, that tends to reduce child labor, because child labor itself is not desirable. What is the trick here? What does dominate? And what does dominate depends a little bit more at what level of income you would be. If you are really, really poor, you have nothing, and you're always struggling for survival of your children, for putting any food, for having any medical care, then higher salaries for everyone would make the whole household go and work, particularly if you see these as a temporal effect. It's now or never. So it's like, well, we are having the boom, coffee prices are high, they are hiring, we are all working. It's what happens during harvest time, right? Everybody goes and work. So you see the kids not going to school during that time. Finally, in developing countries, we are getting a little bit more flexible, and the capital city doesn't rule the academic year all that much anymore. And in some places, you move with the harvest. So the kids can participate in the harvest and attend school in the rest of the time. Anyway, that's for another talk. What it could happen, too, is the opposite. It could be the case that because there is trade, you decrease the labor demand. Not every sector in every country is going to be affected in the same way as you get integrated in the rest of the world. The idea of international trade is exactly that we don't produce everything we consume within the countries, we trade. So if you move from a situation where we used to produce everything we consume, it's an extreme. In the limit, I'm thinking about a country that is totally closed. And now it's more open. Most likely, I'm going to keep on producing those things that I'm better at, and I'm going to import those things that I'm not so good at producing, right? That they are better made in another country. Those sectors may be affected in a negative way, decreasing the labor demand. And you can guess what happens. Working is less attractive, so those children working there perhaps don't have the same incentive, or the parents may receive less wages too. At the same time, the counterbalance effect here works the other way, but we are all poorer. This is the trick of when you ban child labor directly. You put a ban on child labor, and actually you may end up forcing children to do worse types of activities because there is a ban on what they were going to do anyway. And they are so poor that that actually doesn't keep them at home. They have to go and do something else. So some sectors may be affected in this way, some sectors may be affected in the other way. This will be the theory. What happens? What evidence we have? Unfortunately, less evidence that we want to have, but there is something. In general, what we see when we link international trade to levels of child labor is that places that trade more tend to be of higher income, and through that effect, child labor is lower. This is this, I'm going to show you a graph in a moment, but this is the type of finding that different researchers from different places, the academia, like Edmonds and Pavnik, who have been, by the way, they are leaders in this type of work. She is a trade economist. He is an expert on child labor, and I'm following a lot of their own research here in this talk. And they have been doing great work. So anything that you see done by them is worth reading because they are really, really first class. Work that UNICEF had been producing shows exactly the same. And what we find, I pick here Africa because it's one of the poorest areas, and I didn't want to show you a graph that shows that in the US we trade more and we have less child labor, because that's silly. I'm talking within countries that are poor, this is what we find. So in some places you don't find even a relationship that is clear. So this would be a cloud of dots that is not. In the case of Africa, you sort of find a negative relationship. You have, again, child labor in the vertical axis and trade as a percentage of the GDP in the horizontal. And you see that more trade seems to imply less proportion of child labor. And the way this works is through income. It's not just trade per se. It's not that trade makes the magic. It's higher income what does. There is one very interesting piece of work that Eric Edmonds and Nina Pavnik have done looking at the case of Vietnam. They had a panel study. They follow households through time. And this is what in economics we call natural experiments. You cannot experiment like you do in the lab. But sometimes there are changes in policies that allow you to explore how these changes affect families. And what happened in Vietnam was that during the 90s, there was an elimination of the restrictions that were imposed on the trade of rice. Vietnam is rice producer. The rice production is 70% of the economic activity of the households. It's the larger employer of adults and children, the production of rice. You can have your own plot or work for someone else that has a bigger plot, but it's what they do. And the government started liberalizing a little bit in the 90s and allowed trade within the country, within regions in the country that before was not allowed, and with other countries. As a result of this, actually the price of rice, because demand went up, went up. This can have a priori two types of effects. They are producers of rice, and this is good news if you're the producer, but they are also consumers of rice. So suddenly they are paying more for the staple they consume. The demand, the higher prices of rice were associated with higher wages, with higher demand for labor, for both adults and children that massively participate in here. But it made families to increase, to get out of poverty, many of them, to increase, we are not talking about high living standards, but getting out of very low levels of income, and a reduction that accounts for at least 45% of the decline in child labor that you see. Moving people out of poverty. The effect is much larger in those households that are net producers of rice, so they totally benefit from this. The ones that are more net consumers can benefit indirectly from other activities that are associated with the whole country has more income now, but because they consume more rice, the effect is going to be not so fantastic. So far, this has been one of the most serious, objective, well-informed pieces of research that we have, and that's why I'm bringing it to you. We have a little bit of information. I was trying to look for good things that show that the opposite can happen too. And we have to be careful. That's why there is so many, this is this case, this happened there. The net effect, as I was saying, is going to be counterbalanced by perhaps some sectors that are adversely affected. The point is trade going to be overall a positive effect or a negative one? In some of the booms you usually see, what I was mentioning a moment ago, coffee booms in Nicaragua and Brazil, in the extent that this is perceived as something that happens for a short period of time, that is going to end, that may give a good incentive for people to participate, because it's like, now is the time to make money. So you could see the contrary. You could see that this type of boom makes child labor go up. If that increase, that boom, that increase in labor demand, that increase in wages, goes to move people out of poverty, to increase the income of these people, reaches the bottom of the distribution, as we hope it would be, then the effect has to be a positive one. It may not happen all the time. And as I was saying before, you may have sectors that are badly affected because they were inefficient to begin with. So that production doesn't happen anymore. What happened to those families that you usually would require some sort of safety net to give them a chance to go through the transition, right? If you just let it go, then they are going to end up in more poverty than they were before, and probably that is going to increase the participation of the children too. And the problem with that is that the alternative is that these people are not eating or receiving the health that they have, not that the kid is otherwise in school, and that's why we're happy. So the bottom line is to think about poverty as the cause behind of child labor, not trade per se, which is what I think sometimes is missing in the debate. So be careful with that. I'm happy to discuss more, or if you have questions about this. I don't want to be like long, because I know I'm competing with lunch. I was worried about this, so I try to move fast, yeah.
You were talking theoretically about labor opportunity, demand for labor, raising income levels.
Yeah.
Doesn't that assume free competition for labor? And if companies are coming into searching the globe for most desperate labor forces and providing one opportunity where none existed, is there competition for labor and doesn't necessarily promote labor?
At least two dimensions to answer that question. First of all, remember that I was telling you most of these kids do not work for those companies. We have that idea in mind. Those are a very small percentage of the kids that are working. What I'm thinking is that those farmers suddenly are able to trade and get prices for what they are producing, that increasing the demand for the coffee that the kids in Guatemala are producing and that type of thing. But it is important to think that, yes, capital would go and locate it in places that are more favorable because they are in the business of making profits. We may all think that maybe it would be great to share those profits in a different way. It's not the incentives that we have. So we are counting with that. They are going to go to places where the regulation is favorable, where wages are favorable, of course. Is that going to make people worse off or better off? It depends a little bit from where you start. In some places, places, this is sad, but I need to report. It's better that the kid gets to work. Because before is not eating. Before is facing mortality all the time because there is no basic health care. It's not that it's in school and because this factory comes, the kid is like from having a good life now to be working as a slave. So it may happen. How we address this, we have to address it in a different way. But it's not through, instead of saying this so vague, how can I address this? I have to think of forms of public policy. One of the ways that public policy has been addressing the issue of children working is what we call conditional cash transfers that have been, I don't know if any of you is familiar with a program in Mexico that started under the name Progresa and now is called Oportunidades. It's a transfer that the mothers of the kids receive. You actually buy the kids out of labor. They work with their parents too, but you only give the money if the kids attend school 80% of the time, and you take them to regular checkups at the doctor, at the clinic in the village, and so on and so forth. Many countries, many developing countries in Latin America has been a very fashionable type of policy. It's very welcome because it has been properly evaluated and we know has good effects. So that's a way that I could address the problem. No allowing the capital to go to these places is sort of condemning them and to not participate. So that's not the solution either. Of course, if you find that the conditions, the way this happens, they do illegal things, they go under, you can regulate those things as much as the country wants to regulate those things. But that's different from saying, so I'm better off in these firms do not come to Pakistan because this export industry is going to make my kids to work more. Well, I don't know if that's worse for the well-being of the kids. It depends on where we start from. And I swear that the places, some places I don't see any type of very poor places, any type of child labor because there are no opportunities for them. But in some others you see, and the starting point is very low. So.
You just mentioned giving cash incentives to educate children. Have you looked into whether the availability of low-cost, high-quality education is actually incentive to take children out of child labor?
Well, more opportunities for education tend to move them out of child labor just because it's cheaper to acquire education than if the school is very far away, in some sense, because that allows you to come back and take care of the animals, sometimes if you have to walk many miles to go to school. You have touched something that is part of what I'm doing now when you talk about quality. We have been making a lot of progress putting the kids in school in these countries. We know how to do that. Conditional cash transfers seem to work. We understand much better the incentives we have to do and how. The quality, that's another story. You struggle with quality here in the US. I know we debate this all the time. And probably we all have some idea. I'm not going to ask you too much about this. We should have a 3-day on quality of education so you can tell me a lot of these things. But in developing countries, even that we are not happy with some quality of education that we have in the US, the standard is so low, is so really bad that we are far from quality. It doesn't mean that there are not, good cases here and there, that you cannot have, that great teacher that doesn't matter what the circumstances are, makes it. But overall, the level is very, very bad. So quality would matter, probably. one of the things that happens is investing in education makes sense because later there is a return to that education. If there is no return to that education where I am, or the education is so bad that doesn't pay to acquire that education, the kid goes to school, the teacher is not there. Very, very common in many, many places. I mean, it's just amazing the number of absenteeism that you find. Obviously, that's not going to give you any incentive to the parents. So the parents think, oh, I'm sending this kid to school for what? It's better off with me working in the plot. I can talk to the kid. At least it's with me, right? So definitely, that's a dimension to fix. A bit, yeah.
For instance, let's say in India, I think about half the kids in the 5th grade.
Yeah.
Only half. So if you know, for instance, in countries where developing countries where literacy rate is higher. So I don't mean high quality education. At least teachers coming to school, the kids are learning something. They do basic. You know, in countries, developing countries where literacy rate is higher, you find lower literacy.
Well, you do, but the establishing causality, you find the correlation, but establishing what is the causality, I'm sure that the quality of education matters there for all these reasons that I was explaining before, but also that country probably is a richer country as well. So do they go more to school because the school itself is more attractive, the parents think this makes sense, it's a good investment I can do, or to begin with, they are less poor, so the need for work is lower. So you have both things there. Mm-hmm. Totally. I know. Yes. And this is something that I wish we would be working on much more. I've been doing some work related to this in Sao Paulo, Brazil. This is not inequality is very high in Brazil, you may know. So Sao Paulo has from very fancy places to favela where the conditions are bad. But it's a high middle income country. The city itself has a lot of resources. This by far is not the poorest area in Brazil. And some of the information indicates that the kids in the 5th grade, half of them cannot tell you the time on a digital watch. I have no words. This doesn't happen very often, but it's like, what? Definitely, you get there in what I call the production function of education, a mix of things. The kid doesn't care and has low expectations from the very beginning. Doesn't go to school to learn anything. The parents don't send the kid to school to learn anything, and the teachers do not expect anything from those kids anyway. And you end up in an equilibrium where everybody says, like, whatever, it's a good day if we don't kill each other here. And we need to fix that. So this is what I was saying before. Oportunidades, Progresa, in Brazil, this program was Bolsa Familia at some point. Understands a little bit better the incentives to put the kids in school. We are not quite there fixing how we make this work. Now they are in school. How we get education to reach these kids. It's totally different from maybe going to school just to go to school has some benefit. I don't know, the discipline of going to school, I don't know. But if nothing happens there, then I don't know, maybe it's a waste of time. We understand much less how to fix that. And I think there is where your input, I've been talking to the whole teachers union in Sao Paulo at this point. And there are different ideas of how to do this. But as a researcher that wants to evaluate different systems, it's not clear what things work in this context of high poverty.
Can you talk about
Yeah.
As far as poverty,
Well, here you are going to have the opinion of an economist, and you know, we are pro-trade. And the reasons why we are pro-trade is because we think that overall, if you give a little bit of time, this is an efficient, beneficial force. Now, what usually people that are pro-trade are not going to tell you, because criticizing your product doesn't sell all that well, is that not everything is rosy. You are going to have, as I said before, sectors, families, groups, regions that have a negative impact. So when I read these things like, this happened because we opened to trade, and they give you an example of something that is not producing umbrellas in Uruguay anymore because now the umbrellas are coming to China, I think, yeah, I know. And what I need is social policy to address this. But what I can also tell you is that we don't have a single example of a country that has developed and increased from being a poor country to be a rich country without integration to the rest of the world, without trade, without efficient production. The ways you can do it are different. You can do it the brutal way, right? And I don't care about anyone, and they are collateral damage. Or you can do it in a different way. But definitely, my message would be for integration. I come from Latin America. I'm originally from Argentina. We had many years of inward-looking policies and had been very costly. We are still paying for it. I don't think this is totally clear, but to everyone. But I'm convinced this is the case. And I know not everybody is going to agree with this. We can talk more about it. But I think that the evidence is pretty clear about the countries that have been doing better, have been wise about exporting, about selling their products, the products that they are good at. And there is where we see a lot of the good things. And I'm not saying that the road is easy. I think overselling the product is bad. And I can tell you that just opening to trade does not guarantee that you are going to be a rich country in a couple of years or anything like that. There are many other things that have to happen at the same time. But I think being a closed country definitely is an obstacle to success. And in the extent that we develop, you see this type of outcomes. We can agree that child labor is not something we want. We can agree that child mortality is something bad. We can agree that education and investments in kids is something good. And usually they go together.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.